So we've heard a lot about joy, haven't we? Songs of joy, a reflection on joy from Tony. I'm going to feel a little bit like the grumpy uncle who comes along and spoils the party, because when we look at this, as Elaine suggested, there's a lot of joy, there's celebration, there's deliverance, but there's also a fair bit of darkness in there. And that's one of the things that will come out as we come through and look at what's going on in Esther 9 and 10. So I think Elaine's probably very grateful that Esther 10 must be one of the shortest chapters in the Bible after I got all the way through chapter 9. Thank you very much for that. So this is the last part of our sermon series on Esther, and I could think back a couple of months ago when Chris said, "Oh, you okay to preach on Esther 9 and 10? I said, "Yeah, sure." And but it's not an easy book to actually preach on. And you know, we've had all sorts of different ways of looking at it. That Rodney sort of introduced it and talked about the structure of the book, the nature of it, and the way in which you might read it. We've had a variety of different things. And so, you know, what I'm going to be doing is not necessarily going through verse by verse and all that, or telling you a whole lot about it, but it's really some of the impressions, the things that come to me reading this and reflecting on this final part of the book. So the core of today's passage, of course, is in chapter 9, verses 18 to 32. And that regards the establishment of the Feast of Purim. And it's the thing that I'm really thinking about is remembrance as much as joy, because this is all about remembering what has happened. Well, let's remember where we are. So within the reading, there was a recap of the whole story about the plot by Haman to kill the Jews, about the way in which that was overturned, and the things that went on from that, and then the establishment of the festival and the peace that came from that. So Haman's plot to kill the Jews was thwarted by the quick thinking of Mordecai and Esther. And 2 weeks ago in chapter 7, the villain Haman was surprised to find that rather than being honoured, he was actually hanged or executed. Last week, Peter took us through chapter 8, and that's where plans are made to punish the enemies of Jews throughout the kingdom. And one of the things that Peter brought out there was the theme of reversing the irreversible, because it says in the book that when a proclamation has been made by the king of Persia and signed with his signet ring, it can't be undone. But it was undone, and Peter drew parallels with life overcoming death and with the resurrection of Jesus. Today's passage follows on very much from what happened last week. So in chapter 8, it's about how Esther and Mordecai were planning what to do to protect the Jews or whatever. And we start off in chapter 9 by seeing how that king's edict was actually carried out. And then it's followed by the history and the rules of Purim. And the book finishes off with a brief historical note which acknowledges Mordecai's ongoing position of power and the place of Jews within the Persian kingdom or empire at the time. It doesn't really say much about what happens back in Israel or about the future. It's very much focused on what's in that exile period to the community which is still in what was Babylon. So let's have a look at Purim. The name, as is explained in the reading, comes from the pure or lot, and it relates to the occasion in chapter 3, verse 7, where Haman cast lots to determine the actual day on which he would destroy the Jews, the 13th day of the 12th month, or the month of Adar. Purim's celebrated as a festival of deliverance, but it differs from other festivals. So the festival of Passover, for instance, that's the really great sort of thing, and we use that, we refer back to that, and we base our thinking about Easter on Passover. Passover celebrated the deliverance from slavery in Egypt. It's when not only were the Jewish people, the Hebrew people of the time, saved from danger within Egypt, but they're actually released from that slavery. They became a free people, and they became able to then follow God's will and fulfill God's will by establishing his people in the promised land. Although as we saw, there was a few problems on the way. It took them a while to actually get round to doing that, and there was golden calves and the rest. But the Passover celebrated that release from slavery. This one here is also a deliverance. It's a deliverance from a plot to kill the Jewish people, but they still remained where they were as exiles in a foreign land. So it's not quite the full bottle when it comes to that sort of deliverance and freedom. Purim has a particular resonance with the Jewish people through history since the time it was established, because of the number of times that they've come so close to extermination. For instance, one of the first things that Hitler did when he came to power was to abolish the celebration, prohibit the celebration of Purim, because of the way in which it gave them that feeling that they could be delivered from whatever was about to happen to them. And it's not just, the Holocaust or Shoah, that period then, but right through history. There have been pogroms against the Jews. The nation almost disappeared in the time before Christ. It was certainly scattered and dispersed after that. And so time and again there have been all of these sorts of situations where they've come through. And to Jewish people today, Purim is very important as a way of remembering that they still managed to survive despite all that has happened. Purim's somewhat less religious than the other festivals. There are things, certain aspects of it, which are not quite as biblically based, not scripturally based. They don't recite what's called the Hallel, which is the set of psalms which are usually recited at most of the major festivals. And the celebration of Purim has a big focus on fun. So it's the fun holiday in the Jewish calendar. And there are four main parts to the celebration of Purim. So one of them is listening to the reading of the book of Esther in the synagogue, usually twice, once on the evening before the actual day of Purim, and then once afterwards when everybody's had their fill and needs to sit down and have a sleep while the cantor reads the Bible, or reads the scriptures. They give gifts of food to family and friends, and that comes right back. That's there in our reading in Esther. Giving alms to the poor, again, was something which is in that prescription from Esther. And also eating a festive meal, and there's a lot of festivity around it. So there are special triangular pastries called Haman's pockets. I forget what the Yiddish term is, but they're a big feature of that. And it also seemed to be compulsory to eat or drink at least one drink of alcohol during the day. So it's much the way in which we celebrate Christmas, with lots of food, gifts, all that sort of thing, and a general sense of fun. And the date on which Purim is celebrated differs. So in most places it's on the 14th of Adar, but traditionally in places that were walled cities, such as Jerusalem, it's on the 15th. And the reason behind that, you saw there that in the citadel of Susa, the killing finished on the 14th day, and so the 15th day there in the city was the day in which they celebrated. They celebrated on the 14th because the killing was finished on the 13th out in the countryside. So that's Purim, a big fun festival every year, usually sort of round about March, April in terms of our Western calendar, but the Jewish calendar varies around that because it's a lunar calendar. It's been pointed out several times in this sermon series that Esther's an unusual book among scriptural writings. And for instance, it doesn't mention God at all, for instance. And some people have claimed that the whole thing is fictitious and that it's not possible to link the people and the events to what is known from other historical records of the time. And the translation that was read to us today uses the name Xerxes for the king, but it's not certain that the Ahasuerus, or whatever the Hebrew word that is used in the Bible, was actually Xerxes. They don't know quite which king it was. Other people say that the holiday came first, and then the book was written to justify that. But even the latest suggested times for the writing of the book of Esther was so close to the date at which the events were supposed to have occurred that we can be pretty certain that it wasn't made up, and it's certainly based on real events, even if the recollection of those or the flavour that's given to them is not exactly the way it was at the time they happened. It's like us writing about something decades ago. I was trying to remember. I have flown in the cockpit of a plane. You know, I've gone up to the front of an aeroplane and sat in the cockpit, but I cannot remember where that was. It's possibly coming into here to land at Armidale once, but I think it may have been somewhere else. And it's an event that actually happened, but my recollection of it is imprecise enough that I don't know where or when. And if I wrote that into a history of my life, it's not to saying it didn't happen, but just that I got it a little bit wrong. And there's potentially some things like that happen in these recollections as well. The Old Testament contains a lot of history. So both in the books from Genesis to Esther, which are traditionally considered to be the historical books, although there's much more than just history in those, and as well as many of the books of the prophets, books like Daniel, for instance, Isaiah, Ezekiel. There's quite a lot of books like that actually have historical events in them as well. And one thing that characterises all of those historical writings, except for the book of Esther, is that they're given an ethical or moral or spiritual context. Now, the Old Testament, it's one of these things that's often very uncomfortable for us to read as Christians. It really doesn't pull any punches about the things that happened. It really has the good, the bad and the ugly, and in spades. There's great triumphs, there's great acts of faith, but together with other things, great crimes of all sorts, blasphemies, heresies. There's love, there's cruelty, there's devotion, there's disobedience. But always, except in Esther, the scriptures contain within themselves the key to what is right and what is wrong, which things are done in obedience to God's will, and which parts are sin. Sometimes it's in the narrative itself. If you read through Kings or Judges or things like that, the writer of that tells us this was bad, this was good, this followed God's will, this did not. Sometimes it's actually in the words that are quoted, the words of the priests, of the prophets, of the leaders, of others who make comment on what is going around them, who go and say to David, you have done wrong, things like that. And all these are in there sort of explaining the spiritual reasons for events or situations and proclaiming the word of God. But Esther's quite different because it presents all these events quite unadorned. It is a ripping yarn. Again, Rodney went through and talked about that sort of, the narrative, the way it's structured, the kinds of things that are in a good story, and it is a good story from that point of view. But nowhere does it make any kind of comment or judgment on what is right or wrong. And we're invited as readers to make that judgment for ourselves. And if you think that, yes, it does say that this is good or bad, that's because we're reading our interpretation into that, and I'll come back to that in a moment. If Esther was only a justification for a feast, then you might expect it to present only the good bits, to paint the actors, and particularly the Jewish ones, in the best light possible. And this is what people tend to do when they recount the stories of old when it comes to celebrating the achievements of their nation. But Esther has a lot more in it than that, and there are things in the book, and particularly in today's passage, which are really quite disturbing. Now, early on in the series, we were introduced to some of these moral ambiguities. And one of the most obvious ones around the Esther becoming the queen. And effectively what happened is that Mordecai gave up his ward, the person who was entrusted to look after Esther, to become a sex slave. But the book itself says nothing about the wrongs or rights of that, even though what was done was clearly against the Jewish law. In this week's passage, the king allowed Esther and Mordecai to write the rules last week's passage in chapter 8, Esther and Mordecai were allowed to write their own rules for the retribution by the Jews on their enemies. In the first part of chapter 9, we're told how this was acted out, and it's not very pretty. One of the first things they do is to kill the 10 sons of Haman. That was something which Esther specifically asked permission to do, although we're not told about their culpability in the plot against the Jews. On the next day, Esther arranged to have the bodies impaled. And that's sort of basically a stake stuck through them and put on display. And although there's nothing in the Bible which expressly forbids this, the Jewish tradition was to show respect for the bodies of the dead, as it is in many other societies. And for example, one thing in a book I read recently, one of the things that puzzled the Aboriginal people in the area just west of Sydney about the colonists, the early settlers, was their practice of leaving the bodies of hanged people, hanged Aboriginal people, in trees as a warning or a message to them. And they couldn't understand how it was possible to show so little regard, so much disrespect for the dead, even for convicted criminals. Because even when they did execute their own people for crimes, they were given full honour, the dead bodies, just as if they were a favourite aunt. And we certainly would be horrified to hear of similar things today. And after I wrote this, I noticed in the headlines in the Herald this morning about a body having been hung from a crane in the town of Herat in Afghanistan. And the clear implication is that this is something that we would consider to be an unacceptable act, to treat the bodies like that. Yet here is Esther asking the king to be able to do that to these bodies. But the book of Esther says nothing about the rights or wrongs of that, or even the cruelty with which Haman was killed. Now, we won't go into the details there, you'll want to eat your lunch, but it was just awful, really awful, and something that we wouldn't countenance, but it's just accepted, it's just told. We're told that 800 people in Susa and 75,000 others throughout the kingdom were killed. When one day was not enough to do the killing, Esther asked the king for another day. Now, there were rules of engagement. There's this term that's often used in military context, the rules of engagement. And they're given in chapter 8, verse 11. And one of the things, it talks about plunder, and there's issues around plunder because they didn't plunder in the end, and so on. But in terms of killing, it says that they were given permission to destroy, kill, and annihilate any armed forces of any nationality or province that might attack them and their women and children. So that's what the edict that was written by Esther and signed by the king said. But what is described sounds much more like a massacre than a battle. In chapter 9, verse 5, we read, "The Jews struck down all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them." And that would be, if it was a battle, yeah, that's fine. But as the second part says, "And they did what they pleased to those who hated them." And it's those words, "did what they pleased," that is a particular problem, the thing that's most disturbing. Because doing what they pleased had been the root cause of all of the problems, the disobedience to God, the sin throughout the people's history, from Adam and Eve and the fall, right through to the time which is being described then. And it's the thing that we say, we do God's will, we do not do what we please, but this is what they did. And I'm not the only person to have looked at this and come to the conclusion that large-scale war crimes must have been committed on those days, and real slaughter. But again, there's no comment on the right or the wrong. It's just presented as a fact. So why am I banging on about this? I mean, it is, we've been singing about joy, and now I'm going on about these dark things which have happened, and this absence of any sort of comment on whether this is God's will, whether it's right or wrong. Well, the first thing I think, just to bring it to some sort of context for today and something to think about, and this first point is about what it is that we do remember when we celebrate things. Now, just bear with me as I go through this and don't get too offended or upset. It's not going to be as confronting as it might start off sounding like. So one of the most recent major events that has happened in the world is the fall of Afghanistan to the Taliban after 20 years of war. And underneath the noise of COVID, which is all we hear about these days, there's actually a debate going on about how we remember and what it is about Australia's role in that war in Afghanistan and about, how we deal with that. Now, over 40 Australian Defence Force members were killed in the conflict. And as a nation, we need to decide how we're going to honour them, which is something that is right and something that we should do and something we should do with pride. But the story is actually much more complicated than just going in there and having these brave people killed. Over 500 Afghanistan veterans have taken their lives since they came back. That's more than 10 times the number who are actually killed on the ground in the place. And we've had the Brereton inquiry recently, which has found well substantiated evidence of quite serious war crimes which were committed by Australian troops. And there are questions now being as the country has collapsed about whether the intervention, what was done there, was done in the right way that best served the long-term interests of the Afghan people. Now, we're going to need to celebrate what was achieved, but we also need to have a realistic reckoning for the mistakes and the failures so that we can do better in the future and make amends for any wrongdoings that have been done. It's just not just joy for the good things, but in remembering we have to think about the rest of it as well, the fullness of what has gone on, the rights and the wrongs. Now, we're not going to solve the issues of remembering Afghanistan here. It's like everything else, it has to work itself out over time, and it could take decades before we've got it right. But it's an example of the complexities of dealing with even the recent past. These are things which have happened to living people in recent memory. A term you might hear used is the history wars, which refers to an often very acrimonious debate about things like how we deal with understanding the role of slavery in the social dislocations in the United States, or the gross inequalities of wealth that occur in the UK, or closer to home about the treatment of Aboriginal people during the colonisation and the early years of the establishment of a nation. John Howard famously railed against taking a black armband view of history, as he called it, and wanted us to focus on what he saw as the positives. But one thing you come to realise if you look at the Bible, and it's not just Esther, but all of the Bible, is that it doesn't do that. It doesn't just focus on the good. It tells it all, and it uses the bad bits, the uncomfortable bits, the parts that we'd rather not know about or hear about. It uses those to teach us more about God's will for the world and for us. We're told what went wrong, why it went wrong, what the consequences were, and what should have been done so that Israel, in the Old Testament context, and by extension us, can do better next time and conform what we do and how we think and live much closer to God's will for us. That's right, except for the book of Esther. In Esther, we're given the unadorned facts. And everyone who reads Esther applies their own moral judgment, even if they don't realise it while they're doing it at the time. We identify who we think are the goodies and the baddies. We place the action in a moral framework. We decide whether the rewards and the punishments that are described were justified. And because this is the Bible, we also attempt to place the whole episode into what we understand of God's action in the world. And a lot of that we just do without thinking. It's just part of the way in which we look at these things and our expectations. But because Esther, the book of Esther, doesn't do the interpretation the way the rest of the Old Testament does, but leaves it to us, it's actually really important that we do actually have enough knowledge and understanding to do this. So we need to know and be sure what we understand about the character of God. And we understand his will for his creatures, for us. What he wanted to be, for us to be holy as he is holy. What does it mean? And we need to understand the guidance that comes from the prophets, from Jesus, from Paul, all those people who tell us what it is that we should believe, how we should behave, how we should understand events that go on around us and fit them into that context of God's will, God's working and God's purpose. And it doesn't stop just with the Bible, of course, because we need to also think about how those things will apply to what we do, as well as what we read about other people doing, our own lives, our own actions, our own decisions, the things that we've done good, the good things, the bad things. All of those we need to make sure we've got a really firm grip on a biblical view of right and wrong, of good and bad, of the desirable and the undesirable. So that's a bit of a bleak way to finish things in a way, but it is a book that it attracts all sorts of things. If you take it just as a story and the things that it says, well, we'd be preaching the same sermon pretty much every week, but it's something that I've found fascinating to find different ways, different things that come out of it. So yes, we celebrate, we feel joyful for all the great things, but we just need to remember, let's make sure we don't forget the things that we need to learn from and the things that we need to do better, and let's make sure that we really understand what it is that God wants us to be knowing, understanding,